Today we're going to take a look at the importance of learning in organizations. I really should say the growing importance, and I'll get back to that in a moment. We're going to take a look at the multiple ways that we learn, because we learn in more than one way. More complex learning requires more complex ways of doing things, and how we come to use learning to adapt to the situations around us. Now about this growing importance. As jobs become more complex, as more aspects of computers are introduced into jobs, and as jobs change more rapidly, learning takes on more prominence in the organization. As people move more frequently from job to job, and that's just what's happening now, learning is important to individuals in their careers. The phrase quick learner says something about an individual in an organization. If you're going to be moving around every 2-3 years, you're going to be learning not only a new job, but you're going to be learning a new organization. Some of that you learn formally, as we'll see, and some of it is informal. But in order to achieve and to bring yourself up to a level of performance that's really useful to the organization, you're going to have to learn quickly. You're in the organization, and then they redesign the job. You need to learn the job all over again. You're using a piece of software. 2 years later, a new version comes out. They upgrade you. You need to learn things all over again. So learning is of enormous importance. So what is this process that we call learning? Well, if we look at a definition of learning, if we can go to the computer graphic, okay, we see that learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior which results from experience. The experience can be underlined when you look at the definition. Underlined because there are other ways that we change behavior. We change behavior just because we grow up and we mature. Okay, physiological reasons for changing behavior. Or behavior changes for other external reasons and not due to our experience. We're sick, we're fatigued, we've had a little bit too much to drink. Behavior changes due to those kinds of things do not qualify as learning. So it's a change in behavior, relatively permanent, because once you've learned, we think that it endures a long time, longer than you know, due to experience. How do we know that you've learned at all? It's a toughie. We talked about how do we know about your attitudes? Well, we have to ask you, how do we know that you've learned? We test you. We look at your performance one way or another to see if you've learned. But how often have you walked out of an exam and say, I really studied and I really know that stuff? But somehow the questions were on the things that I didn't spend the same amount of time on. So I really didn't get a chance to express, to show everything that I learned. Or I really studied, but I went in there and I was so nervous, I just couldn't perform well. If I were more relaxed, I could have done a lot better. So we rely on people's performance as a measure of learning. But it's not perfect. It's the best thing that we have. And certainly it reflects learning, but understand that it reflects a few other things as well. If you're really motivated, you're going to try a lot harder on that test. So motivation counts. If you're anxious, it interferes. That detracts. If you're tired or you're sick, that detracts. So other things figure in. Your own feelings, your own situation at the time. And the other thing is the opportunity to display what you've learned. If you can't show somebody, if nobody ever gives you the opportunity How are you going to demonstrate that you've learned something? So the opportunity to perform is important in learning. And what gets learned in organizations? Well, two things. We have formal learning and informal learning. What counts as formal learning? All of the skill training that you're going to have to go through when you join an organization. You learn a lot here, but you're going to hear the phrase on-the-job training. You learn an awful lot once you get on the job. In some instances, you will go through formal training classes before you even start the job. There are schools, for example, for management trainee classes. There are organizations that actually run training programs where they take you off the job to, if you will, kind of their own organizational campus and keep you there while they teach you the way they do things in that organization. So skill training is clearly one as you learn the various processes. And that skill training for a management position could go on for over a year, on and off. You're not going to be doing it all the time. First intensively, then on the job, and then back for more training, and then on the job again. You also, through orientation, learn the rules and the regulations about the workplace, essentially the handbook. What is it that you have to do to conform to the way things are done in this organization? So those are some of the formal things that you learn in the organization. And what about the informal things? What comprises the informal things in the organization? Well, the norms. How does one dress in that organization? And organizations clearly have dress codes. They have dress codes for dressing up, and they have dress codes for dressing down. We hear a lot now about things called Dress Down Fridays. Dress Down Fridays doesn't mean you can come in any way you want, though. There's still a code very often for that as well as to what's acceptable. So a common norm that's learned. You learn the norms for when is the appropriate starting time. Do you have to be really prompt in that organization? Do you have to be better than prompt? Is everybody there early? And what about going home? Does everybody cut out the minute work is over? Do people hang around, stick around kind of late? So you learn that. And when you have a problem, you learn who to go to in the organization. You learn who's approachable and who isn't, who's willing to help you, who's willing to give you time, and who would more likely brush you off. You learn who to trust in an organization. Who's the person you're going to go to if you want to find out news about something? You hear a rumor going around and you want to verify it. Who do you trust? And when you have a problem, who can you confide in the organization? This is part of the informal learning. And yet something else that goes on in organizations as well. It's what I call shortcuts for doing a job. Because if you did the job exactly according to the book, most organizations, work would slow down and it would become very inefficient. So there are shortcuts that people learn in every organization in order to make work flow more efficiently, effectively, more smoothly. As a matter of fact, occasionally we will hear about companies where there is a work slowdown while people work according to the book. They do things exactly according to the book all the way through. Very necessary. And where do you learn the shortcuts from? Not in your official training classes and not in the handbook. They're never going to tell you those things, but you learn it informally from your coworkers. So another aspect of informal learning in the organization. So these are the kinds of things that get learned. How do they get learned? We're going to be looking over this lecture and the next one at 3 models of learning. We'll tackle today classical conditioning, and we'll tackle that in just a minute. We will start operant conditioning and finish it in the next session. And finally, we will look at observational learning, and that will be in the next session to give you an idea of where we're going with learning. There is so much to consider. We really need 2 sessions to do it. First, classical conditioning or anticipatory learning. Classical conditioning is learning by anticipation. Something is going to stand for something else. And in fact, it takes 3 conditions or events for us to learn in terms of classical conditioning. The first thing that we need to understand is that classical conditioning refers to learning for very simple behaviors, reflexes, emotional responses. So we're not dealing with anything very complicated here in terms of learning, and that will mean that there's a limitation to it. So you start basically with a reflex. What's a reflex? Well, if there's a puff of air directed at your eyes, you're going to blink. That's a reflex. We think of them as behaviors over which we have absolutely no control. They happen automatically. There is some external stimulus out there in the environment that triggers a response in us. If the doctor hits your knee in a certain part, you have the knee-jerk reflex. So we understand what kind of behaviors we're talking about. The event out there that triggers it is called the unconditioned stimulus, the puff of air. Or it all started with Pavlov and his dogs that drooled or salivated. It was the food that made the animals salivate. Or the doctor tapping our knee for the knee-jerk reflex. Or smelling something horrible gives you a gag reflex. You know how you feel in that situation. So we're talking about reflexes. You start with that. But then you take some other stimulus of some kind called the initially neutral stimulus. It later becomes the conditioned stimulus. And the qualification for that is it has to be something that absolutely has nothing to do with bringing about the reflex. So if we're talking about blinking, maybe tapping. Tapping doesn't make us blink. Nobody's blinking, okay? In the case of Pavlov and the dogs in classical conditioning, a bell was used. Again, a sound, okay? So this conditioned stimulus initially is not going to bring about, is not going to elicit, is not going to pull the reflex behavior, the reflex response. You take the conditioned stimulus, initially neutral, the bell, the tapping, and you pair it so it comes just slightly ahead of the unconditioned stimulus, the puff of air, the food, and you do this for several times. And something happens. The something that happens is that the human, the animal, no longer waits for that unconditioned stimulus to occur to respond. The reflex behavior moves up in time. If we can go back to the overhead, not the overhead, the graphic, okay. It moves up in time so that it now occurs when the conditioned stimulus occurs. And you don't even have to wait for the unconditioned stimulus. The animal starts to salivate at the sound of the bell. Forget the food. I'm conditioning somebody to blink. They'll start to blink if I do this, and we don't need the puff of air. Okay, associations that are made. And we make these associations all the time. We do it particularly as humans with our emotional responses. A dog charges at you, barking. You get frightened. It's a natural emotional response. The next time, all you have to do is see the dog to feel frightened. The sight of the dog alone becomes the stimulus to trigger that response. So we can begin to see how our emotional responses get conditioned to lots of different situations. And sometimes we don't even have to experience the situation directly to learn the emotional response. Many people have never handled a snake, and yet show them a snake and they recoil. And we'll cover how that's learned when we talk about observational learning. So we have then the three things. We have the reflex behavior. We start with that. We have the originally neutral stimulus, and we have the pairing of the neutral and unconditioned stimulus, so that that neutral stimulus can take on the same kind of power to elicit, to bring out a response. Let's look at a couple more examples. If one of the behavioral responses you have when you get anxious is to start to sweat, and if you get called into the boss's office on an occasion and the boss really makes you anxious and you start to sweat, it could be through conditioning that you'll start to sweat every time you see your boss. You've conditioned the response, that emotional response, so that just the sight of your boss brings it about. Babies and crying. And we'll get to some of you and pets. Young children, pets, they kind of operate the same way. Young children spend a lot of time, infants, in the pediatrician's office. They get inoculated. They get a lot of shots. Doesn't take very long for that infant to learn the sight of the doctor is a cue, is a signal for getting a shot. And if you walk into a pediatrician's office, you're going to hear a lot of crying going on. Children learn very quickly. Okay. The pain that the child experiences from the inoculation triggers the crying response. That's the reflex behavior. But the sight of the doctor quickly gets associated with whatever pain's going to happen, and bingo, they learn to cry quickly. Let's look. Some of you have pets. Animals learn very quickly too. What about when you go to feed your pet? Somebody want to describe what happens? Feeding time for the pet. When do they come running? When you call the animal? Before that? Altanique, you want to tell us about?
I have a cat, and in the morning, his food is usually in the closet. And if you open the closet door, he'll come running.
That's it?
Yeah. In the afternoon, when it's in the refrigerator, he see the refrigerator door open, then he'll come running too.
Right, okay, so that in the first case, the conditioned stimulus in the morning is the closet door opening and running for the food. In the second case, it's the refrigerator door. We had another situation with a pet in the classroom too. Yeah, Francois.
I have a dog. Every time you open, because he's in the yard, so every time I open the back door, he comes running.
To go out? Or to get
he's
food?
outside. He comes running.
Come running inside. Okay, for food. Okay, right. Okay, so the animal's outside, okay, and the cue for getting fed is opening the door, okay, to come running inside. Even though the dog doesn't get fed on every occasion, you open the door. Still, it's the cue, and it's in anticipation of whatever dog yummies you're feeding your pet. It's the same kind of thing, classical conditioning, simple kinds of behaviors, okay? So we've got the acquisition part of it, okay? We need to deal with a few more basics in classical conditioning, a few more things that come about. One is extinction. We're not necessarily stuck with these behaviors forever. We can unlearn the same way that we learn, although if it's conditioned thoroughly, it takes some doing. Extinction is a way of eliminating the conditioned response. And it is eliminated by removing, for a period of time, going to go backwards, the unconditioned stimulus. If you never present the conditioned stimulus, if all you have is the tapping, and you never have the puff of air backing it up, after a while the tapping becomes ineffective. If all you have is the bell and there's never any food backing it up, after a while the bell becomes ineffective. And thankfully, after the inoculations stop, after a while, children eventually learn that the doctor's a nice guy. And they do stop crying. Well, by the time they're 5, it takes a while to do this. So we can. It may take several attempts at extinction till we get rid of it, but eventually we can get rid of the conditioned response in working at it. We're very efficient learners. And we're efficient due to the process of generalization. Generalization says that we extend the conditioned response beyond that specific unconditioned or conditioned stimulus. We extend it beyond the specific conditioned stimulus which we're exposed to a whole range of similar stimuli. We generalize, which means that we don't have to learn a response over again every time we're in a similar but not exactly the same situation. This is useful, very useful to us. We are in a situation which could somehow be harmful to us. Example, reflex response. We touch a hot stove. We take our hand away. We don't have to go around touching every hot stove. We learn that stoves are hot. We generalize, okay? So it's very efficient. We're responding to a class of stimuli. That young child, that infant that's crying at doctors may wind up through generalization crying at other people. If the doctor wears a white coat, crying at anybody who's wearing a white coat. The barber, the ice cream vendor, if the ice cream vendor wears a white coat. That could be a generalization in terms of the stimulus. And so it goes beyond. As a matter of fact, in terms of generalization, I'll tell you the story of little Albert. And this was a piece of research that was done back in the 1930s at Columbia in terms of conditioning. Little Albert was, 2, 3 years old. And a famous researcher by the name of Watson wanted to experiment in terms of the whole area of generalization and conditioning, and conditioned this child to be frightened of the white fuzzy bunny by sounding a gong every time the bunny was put in front of little Albert. At first, little Albert liked the bunny, cute little animal hopping around, but then learned to be afraid of it because this gong sounded and there was a startle response. But then it generalized. It just wasn't the cute fuzzy bunny. It went to anything that was fuzzy. And there was even some fear exhibited towards fur coats. Okay, generalization. So you can see that fear responses really do generalize. They go beyond. So we're very efficient, but sometimes this efficiency in learning is not helpful to us. We overgeneralize from the situations that we experience to situations that we think other people experience as well, and they don't experience those situations. They experience things very differently than we do. So one of the problems is, yes, we're efficient learners. We learn to generalize, but we overgeneralize to situations. And sometimes you want to limit the amount of learning to specific situations. So what do we do in that case? We need to engage in discrimination. In this case, discrimination is not a bad word. Discrimination is really learning to distinguish between a specific stimuli to which we want to learn a response and other stimuli that we don't want to have that response to. If there is a particular dog in the neighborhood that's troubling, that's ferocious, you want to steer clear of that dog. And that's a good survival response. You don't want to go near and approach that dog. But you don't want to respond that way to all dogs. And so with little children, we want to teach them then to discriminate between the big dog that's ferocious and the cute little friendly poodle that's next door and wouldn't harm anybody. Okay? Distinctions that we need to learn to make in our lives so that we don't go around avoiding things we have no need to avoid. And finally, higher order conditioning. Again, we respond to, or we extend our response to remote conditioned stimuli. So it's not just the initial one that we learn to respond to, conditioned stimuli, but we start as humans particularly linking things up. Let's go back to the little kid. This little child may learn to cry not at the sight of the doctor, but then at the sight of walking into the office, and then outside the office when you see the building. Much the same way, if you bring your pets to the veterinarian, what happens? We have any, okay, John?
They get nervous
At what point?
when they go inside.
Inside? Okay. What about, some people only put their pets in the car when they take them to the vet. And that's the point. It's just getting into the car is the signal. That's that higher order linking. Okay, and we do the same thing. There are people who are uncomfortable, anxious about going to the dentist. And what makes them anxious really is sitting in the office listening to the sound of the drill and the discomfort that they feel. But some people start to feel a little bit anxious just sitting in the office, remote. And some people even more remote when they have to make the phone call, they're already getting a little bit queasy. And for some people, just talking about it may do it. So we respond in this linking together in terms of higher order conditioning. Just thoughts can trigger certain things. But classical conditioning is quite limited. It deals only with reflexes and simple emotional responses. And it is passive. What do I mean by passive? No matter how quickly that dog salivates, it won't bring the food any faster. No matter how quickly you blink, if I condition you to a puff of air, it won't make that puff of air necessarily go away. No matter how fast that child starts to cry in the doctor's office, the inoculation is still going to come. So it's an anticipation, but it doesn't change the situation to make it any better for the individual. It's passive learning. It's simple learning and it's passive learning. So we need then to look at more complex types of learning and a more complex model. Operant conditioning. Learning by consequences. Some event occurs after our behavior, and if it's a positive event, if it's a pleasant event, it's likely to strengthen that behavior. You reward people for doing the kinds of things that you want them to do. We're going to leave the punishment, the discipline side of things to next time. What we're going to consider for the balance of our time here is encouraging desired behaviors in the organization. The antecedent part of this is some kind of cue or signal that some consequence will happen. And we come to respond to the cues. We don't need to wait for the consequence. What are cues in organizations? Advice people give us can be a cue. Some other antecedents are looking at other people's behaviors. Other people become a cue for us in the organization. And we learn that we have to behave in certain ways when other people are present. As a matter of fact, we typically moderate our behavior when other people are present. We don't behave the same way alone as we behave in the presence of other people. There's a whole set of social behaviors that we engage in, if you will, the rules of behavior, the rules of social interaction, manners. We show our manners with other people. And sometimes one person can trigger certain types of behaviors. Look busy, the boss is coming. Sight of the boss becomes a cue for this behavior looking busy. How is it that we learn in the area of operant conditioning? Well, through two types of reinforcements. That consequence becomes really powerful. One of the reinforcements is positive reinforcement. And with positive reinforcement, the response gets strengthened by its presence. It's usually some kind of very pleasant event, this positive reinforcement. Food is frequently used as a positive reinforcement. Be good and I'll give you a cookie. You did a great job, I'll take you out to lunch. So food. And we reward ourselves with food as well. As soon as I finish this section, I'm going to fix myself a big snack. Attention. Attention is a powerful reinforcer. We crave attention in all kinds of ways, and sometimes in the worst way. People will do all kinds of things to get attention, sometimes behaving outrageously, acting in negative ways, but they're still getting attention. Children who act up in classrooms. Works, they get attention. The spotlight is shown on them. And we need to, because people do crave attention, and it works so well in the workplace, let me say, is not only catch people when they're being bad, we need to catch them when they're being good as well. And that takes extra effort in your role as manager, to notice people when they're getting the job done on time and when they're putting in extra effort and when the job is well done. So, attention. Money. People will do a lot of things for money too. Another positive reinforcer. Status. Another positive reinforcer. Recognition. All of these things, sense of achievement, positive reinforcers for us. And they strengthen a response by their presence. But the other thing that interestingly can strengthen a response is something called a negative reinforcer. If we can go back to the overhead, negative reinforcer. The negative reinforcer increases a desirable behavior's occurrence by its removal. If we can take it away, if we can get rid of it, if we can avoid it altogether, getting rid of it will strengthen a certain type of response. I'm going to give you some, and negative reinforcers are often unpleasant kinds of things. We want to avoid them. We want to avoid getting yelled at. We want to avoid embarrassing situations. We want to avoid painful situations. We want to avoid anxiety-producing situations. We want to avoid situations that make us feel guilty. And in fact, we do. All of these negative emotions that I mentioned serve as negative reinforcers for us, and positive reinforcers. Much of our behavior, our social behavior, is sustained by avoiding these negative reinforcers in life. What would happen if we never felt guilty? Can you imagine what this world would be like? You could do whatever you wanted to, and you'd never have to experience the pangs of guilt. Take things that don't belong to you, lie all the time, cheat, steal. No guilt. Wouldn't bother you. Think about how guilt keeps us in line socially. We learn to do things. First of all, we learn to be guilty about engaging in certain types of behaviors. That's taught to us. And then we learn behaviors that avoid these feelings. Negative reinforcers. You learn to be honest with your friends and in general because you don't want to feel guilty about telling a lie. You learn not to hurt people because you don't want to feel guilty about hurting them. You learn not to rob and hurt and maim and everything else. And in each instance, it's avoiding guilt that encourages that type of behavior. We learn to avoid embarrassing situations. We don't want to be embarrassed. We engage then in all the conventions of social manners because we don't want to be embarrassed. We avoid that. It sustains those social conventions. And there's yet one other negative reinforcer, very powerful negative reinforcer, besides all of these negative emotions that I talked about, and we'll go back to some examples of these in just a minute. That negative reinforcer is effort. We do all kinds of things to avoid putting in effort into things. We take the shortcuts in life. We use the remote controls. I like to use the remote control as a metaphor for negative reinforcer. How tough is it to get out of a chair and go change a channel? But we'll spend all kinds of time looking for the remote control because it's so easy to hit our finger on the remote control. We'll learn to do those, engage in those kinds of behaviors that take less effort. Just look at that over your own behaviors and over other people's behaviors. And so when you're trying to get somebody to change a behavior, if it's going to take a lot of effort, chances are that's not what's going to be learned. People will learn or engage in the behavior that will take less effort on their part. Telecommuting. Think about telecommuting. Can sleep later in the morning. Don't have to get dressed. Less effort. Okay, for people who like that, pretty popular. If they could do it, they would. Okay? Avoiding effort. So yet another negative reinforcer out there. And the combination of positive and negative reinforcers sustain a great deal of our behaviors. We do look busy when the boss is coming because we want to avoid getting yelled at. We're prompt in the workplace because, again, we want to avoid getting yelled at, getting scolded, getting reprimanded. We're honest in our dealings. In this case, usually to avoid feeling guilty, but in some instances to avoid jail. If one doesn't work, there's always the other. So an important aspect in learning, we use a combination of both things in organizations when you're managing behavior, a combination of positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers. What about the qualities of reinforcement? Well, we need to think about some aspects of reinforcement. Reinforcement that comes fast, that's immediate, is much more powerful than reinforcement that's delayed. The sooner you can reinforce, the better the behavior is learned. Waiting to do something sets up a learning situation that's not very powerful. If somebody does a good job, tell them immediately. Sure, we're humans. We can understand delays, but learning is still more powerful if you do it immediately. And if you need to discipline, and we'll get to that next time, the sooner, the faster you discipline, the better the situation is. So that's one consideration in setting up a better learning situation, a better learning environment. Get the reinforcements out there as fast as you possibly can. Another consideration is contrived versus natural reinforcers. The truth is, we respond to lots of contrived reinforcers in life, add-ons, things that don't occur naturally as part of the behavior. We're paid for the work that we do. Pay is a contrived reinforcer. Somebody congratulates us on a job well done. Another contrived reinforcer. It's coming externally. But there are some behaviors that we engage in that have natural reinforcers built into them. And those become really behaviors that are easily learned because the reinforcement is just part of doing it. It comes so immediately that it makes for a very powerful learning situation. Let's take a situation that a lot of students have experienced. The semester starts, and you say to yourself, this is really going to be the semester I'm going to succeed. You know what you have to do. People have been drumming it into your heads. You know you have the ability. This is the semester you're going to start from the very beginning, take out the books, hit the books, and make Dean's List. But something happens along the way, and it's happened to you before. Things intervene, things interfere. Life has a way of not working out quite the way you planned it. And so there you are on your way to the library to get the books and start the project early, and you went to a group of friends, and they say, let's have lunch. Well, lunch sounds a lot better to you than going to the library. And what is it about lunch that's so inviting? Well, first of all, being with your friends is more interesting, immediately built into that, than going to the library. And then you get a lot of social reinforcement from your friends as well. They acknowledge you, they give you affirmation, they give you attention, and it's happening immediately. When are you going to get the reinforcement for going to the library? Well, maybe by the midterm, maybe at the end of the semester. The reinforcements for going to the library, contrived. They're going to come when you get a good grade on a midterm or a good grade on a paper. Get the feeling for why that behaviors that have natural reinforcers built into them are so powerful. Eating something that's delicious. It's that immediate savoring of the taste of something that's so reinforcing to us versus dieting. When do you see the results of dieting? It's going to take weeks till you see the results of dieting. It's going to be slow, okay? And yes, dieting in a sense does have a natural reinforcer built into it, but it's really delayed till you can start to fit into the clothes that you want. And it's waiting for people to say, gee, you look better, and that's not going to happen for a few weeks. So you can see why it's so much easier to eat the good foods than to go on a diet. Flopping in a chair and watching television, going out and doing that jog you should know to stay in condition. Why is it so much easier to flop in the chair? Well, the reinforcers for that are immediate. And the reinforcers for the jog? You know, you're going to later look at yourself and say, gee, I really feel well, and you're going to have to sort of talk yourself into it, but usually you don't go out there and say, I love sweating. That doesn't usually happen. And so you can see that anything that has a natural reinforcer built into it is a powerful behavior. There are problems, of course, because sometimes these behaviors that have the natural reinforcers built into them are behaviors we really shouldn't be engaging in. We should be engaging in other types of behaviors. We shouldn't be engaging in the socialization. We should be engaging in working on our projects. That's a problem. We need to learn how to overcome these things. Or we shouldn't be sitting down at the big ice cream sundae. We should be out there jogging. We shouldn't be socializing in the workplace. We should be working on a project, making phone calls or doing something like that. So we need to, where we can, get people to adjust to the fact that they're going to have to either deal with a delayed reinforcer, or as managers, we're going to have to build in some contrived reinforcers to strengthen the kinds of outcomes that we really want to have. Another aspect, large versus small reinforcers. Large works better. Big pay raise is better than a small pay raise. Large gets somebody's attention, and it is more reinforcing. But it's also the relative size of something. Because if you're used to something that's substantial, you're making $30 million a year, a couple $1,000 increase isn't going to mean anything to you. You adjust to certain things. And so we have to think about the relative size of reinforcement and what we call somebody's reinforcement history. That matters. What have they been used to in getting in reinforcements? And now, what's coming along? So what may work as a reinforcer with one person isn't necessarily going to work with another person. And people kind of adapt to situations after a while, too. And it's no longer reinforcing for them. And so you need to change reinforcers as well. Well, one small example before we move on. It's an interesting little story about reinforcement in terms of adapting to reinforcers. It's not a true story, but it's a good fable about this shoemaker, an immigrant who lived in a neighborhood where a group of tough kids came by and yelled slurs at him all the time. He was really upset by it, but he had an idea. His idea was, I'm going to pay these kids for yelling at me. And so he calls the kids and he says, okay. He says, come by and I'm going to pay you $2 for yelling the worst slurs you possibly can. And the kids think this is great, and they're yelling. Next week they come by and he says, business not so good. I can only pay you $1. Well, they yell, but for $1, you don't yell as loud. And the next week he says, business is really getting bad, 50 cents. They barely yell at all. And then finally he says, so bad I can't afford to pay you. And they said, it's not worth our yelling. Looking at reinforcement history about what's going on there, relative reinforcers. Okay, that's also going to be a good example for one of the things that we'll talk about at the very end. So all of these things are things to consider. So far, we've been talking about reinforcement as if reinforcement was occurring every time we behaved in a certain way, or it wasn't occurring at all. Life isn't like that. Sometimes we get reinforced, sometimes we don't. What happens in this case? Well, we call this type of reinforcement partial reinforcement, occasional reinforcement. Sometimes it happens, but sometimes we engage in the behavior and we don't get reinforcement. And we then consider what are called schedules of reinforcement. There are basically two types of schedules of reinforcement. One is the interval schedule based on time, and the other is the ratio schedule based on performance. Sometimes it's just a matter of time elapsing, and then we get a reinforcement. An example would be a paycheck. 2 weeks elapse, you get paid. You have to keep working in the interim, but your reinforcement comes at the end of a 2-week interval, and you know it's coming then. As a matter of fact, when the interval is always the same, when it's always constant, we call it a fixed interval schedule. One of the interesting things that sometimes happens with fixed interval schedules is that behavior kind of tails off right after a reinforcer, because you know that it's going to be a little while till the reinforcer comes again, and then it picks up again. And you get kind of a scalloping effect. So we could look at that people are always more likely to be absent before payday than on payday. Right after payday, they're even more likely to be absent. Okay, the scalloping effect. Or if you look at your own behavior, you see this own erratic shape to your behavior, that your studying really picks up around the time that you're going to get grades, and then it tapers off again until the next time. Well, we can overcome this with something called a variable interval schedule. In other words, you're going to get some kind of reinforcer after an interval, but you just don't know when that interval is going to be. It keeps shifting on you. It's variable. I can't imagine anybody ever wanting to get paid on a variable interval schedule, knowing that you get a certain number of checks every year, but you might get 5 of them in 1 month and 2 in another month and 4 in another month or something like that. Wouldn't work there. But we do see it working in an area called spot inspection, where you want to make sure that people keep up the intensity of their behavior all along. Like a restaurant meeting health codes, they send out spot inspectors to check restaurants to make sure they're meeting health codes, and you don't give a warning as to when it's going to happen. And it could happen frequently, could be in a cluster, or it could be stretched out. And at that point, the behavior is always kept up at a more intense level. So you have to think about situations where you need that variable interval schedule. The other schedule is the ratio schedule based on performance. And in much of life, we're reinforced based on how much we perform or do something. A good example of that is something called piecework that occurs in the needle trades in particular. You get paid a base rate and then a certain bonus based on how many more pieces of something that you make. Okay, you're paid on your performance or your production. Same thing happens in terms of commissions. Okay, if it's fixed, if it's you get paid for every 50 shirts that you make or something like that, then again what the effect is on behaviors, it speeds it up. People start performing faster to get the rewards faster, more rewards in a shorter period. So it speeds up behavior. And on the variable ratio, we can go back to the overhead. Can we go, okay. You could go a really long time without getting a reinforcement, or it could come close together. Well, I could come up with some examples in the work situation, but in fact, the most compelling example of that is if you're playing a slot machine and you're hitting the lever, okay? You don't know when you're going to get your reinforcement. It could be that reinforcements will come quickly together. It could be that it will be a long time before you hit the jackpot. The effect of being on a variable ratio schedule is that people will engage in the behavior for really long periods of time without it ever extinguishing, because you just never know if sometime out there's going to be some kind of reinforcement coming. For people who fish, could be a long time between bites out there, and yet people go fishing all the time. So variable ratio schedules sustain behavior for long periods of time. You don't know when the reinforcement is coming. Very resistant to extinction. And finally, we want to consider shaping. It's the reinforcement of successive approximations of desired behavior. Sometimes the behavior is so complex that you can't teach it all at once. You have to get successive approximations of it. First example. Okay, you could shape my behavior right here in this classroom. Now, what's reinforcing to me? Well, positive expressions on your face, looking as if you're really involved and interested. So if I move over here and you look really bored and disinterested, I might take a step this way and you look as if you're a little more interested. Now you've got me standing in this position. I go this way, bored again, this way, interested. You want to get me over there. So at this point you say, we're going to start looking bored again at this point until she moves another step. And I go this way and you perk up and you're interested again. You're shaping my behavior, okay? You reinforce it when I'm in a certain position. I'm not all the way over there yet. It's successive approximations. When I get to a certain position heading in that direction, you withhold it until I take the next step, until finally you've got me all the way over here at the edge, and I'm just lecturing from this side of the classroom. You've shaped me, you've gotten me to move into, very gradually, a position where you want me in the classroom. Shaping sounds like it could be a really powerful way to change behavior, and it is if you can control enough of the reinforcers. In the workplace, how might you use it? Suppose you have somebody who has a good worker, but an incredibly messy workplace, and you want to shape this person up so that the workplace becomes somewhat neater. Well, it's not going to happen overnight. People don't get neat just like that. You've got to shape that behavior. And so you start with maybe, well, let's just get some of the garbage into the waste paper basket. Let's start with that. And you reinforce that behavior. And once you get the garbage into the waste paper basket, you say, well, maybe now we can get the tools off the floor and up onto a workbench. And so you reinforce that. And then finally, you get it to the point where maybe we can even get the tools back into their specific boxes where they're supposed to be, shaping the behavior so that you gradually get it to the final state that you want it in, working with successive approximations. And so today, we started out with learning the role of organization, role of learning in the organization, formal, informal, and then looked at a very simple form of learning, classical conditioning, and moved on to some aspects of a more complex type of learning, operant conditioning. Next time, we will pick up with more of operant conditioning and learning how it works in terms of the role of punishment and discipline, and finally dealing with yet the last model or variety of learning, and that is observational learning.